Nicaragua, the largest country in Central America. It's a country of lakes, volcanoes, and beaches, unique ecosystems stretching from the Pacific to the Atlantic. It's also a country living in fear. Nicaragua's presidential couple, Daniel Ortega and his wife Rosario Murillo, are behind a campaign of repression that's weaponized the police, dismantled the judicial system, purged the army, and led to the deaths of scores of Nicaraguans. Today, the regime is a marital autocracy. Rosario Murillo, who was the first lady, is now the co-president alongside her husband. The couple have turned Nicaragua into the only sovereign country with two presidents. And the regime has imprisoned even former allies of Ortega's, accusing them of treason against the homeland. These are people who fought alongside Ortega to bring down the previous dictator, Anastasio Somoza. Other critics of the regime have been stripped of their citizenship and exiled. How did Daniel Ortega, who started as part of a movement to fight poverty in Nicaragua, end up a dictator who uses violence to stay in power? I'm David Levitz, and in this episode of our series Unmasking Revolutions, we'll hear from a few people to try to help us answer that question. Writer Gioconda Belli was persecuted by the previous dictatorship for her involvement in the socialist group co-founded by Ortega, the Sandinista National Liberation Front. Decades later, she fled Nicaragua to escape Ortega's authoritarian regime.
They have branded so many of us as dissidents, sent us into exile, taken away our citizenship, confiscated everything, our homes, even our pensions. The level of cruelty and disregard for the law in Nicaragua is unprecedented. I don't think even Somoza went this far. There are crimes, illegal arrests with no legal process, no due process at all. Recently, for instance, they took people from their homes and later returned two of them dead, offering no explanation, just telling the families to bury them quickly. People are so afraid to speak out. Everyone is terrified.
Eline van Ommen is a professor of contemporary history and a scholar of the Nicaraguan Revolution, also called the Sandinista Revolution. She says the rest of the world has forgotten Nicaragua.
I've spoken to many people who went to Nicaragua in the 1980s, but very few of them really know or think about the country much nowadays, which is a shame for Nicaragua, for the people there who obviously didn't just disappear off the face of the earth. They're still there, they still have their kind of daily life, their struggles, but they don't get the attention anymore from the international public opinion that they probably deserve and need.
DW reporter and historian Jaime González Arguedas says the presidential couple see themselves as above the law.
What we see within Ortega's system is a purely personal project of power. There is a complete absence of ideology, just one guiding principle: the presidential couple must remain in power.
Daniel Ortega first rose to power as part of the Nicaraguan Revolution, but in 1990 he lost the presidential election to opposition candidate Violeta Chamorro. So how did he end up becoming president again? Essentially for life. To understand what happened, we have to go way back to the early hours of December the 23rd, 1972. That night, a 6.2 magnitude earthquake and two aftershocks destroyed Nicaragua's capital, Managua. 75% of homes and buildings in the downtown area collapsed. Fires raged through the city, blazing for the next 2 weeks. So many people were buried under the rubble that the total number of victims was never known. But reports spoke of more than 10,000 dead and nearly 20,000 injured. Almost all of the city's urban infrastructure was wiped out, including hospitals. It was also a fatal blow to industry and commerce. Nicaragua needed foreign aid, and a lot of countries sent it. Huge amounts of aid came from all over the world. But helping the victims was never the priority for the dictatorship that ruled Nicaragua at the time, a regime that had been in place since 1937, when Anastasio Somoza Garcia, head of the National Guard, officially took power after staging a coup. Over the next decades, his children would inherit his power. Luis Somoza Debayle led the regime until he died in 1967, and was succeeded by his brother, Anastasio Somoza Debayle, also known as Anastasio II. And when the 1972 Managua earthquake hit, it was Anastasio II who declared himself responsible for distributing the aid.
He named himself the head of the Emergency Commission. And through that commission, they began stealing millions from the aid that people sent to Nicaragua. When all the earthquake relief arrived, and it was a huge amount, we started realizing that the National Guard under Somoza was keeping everything. For example, you would see the tents that had been sent as aid set up in the yards of Somoza's supporters, the Somocistas, or the guards. And the military wives were even setting up little shops with the canned food and other supplies that had been donated.
Of the $32 million that Washington initially sent to Nicaragua for the reconstruction of Managua, Anastasio Somoza could account for only $16 million. The other $16 million simply disappeared. And much of the $16 million he did account for ended up either in the Somoza family's finances or in the pockets of the small circle surrounding him. One of Somoza's schemes was to build housing developments on land he owned, present them as reconstruction projects, and then sell them to the state at highly inflated prices. His father had already amassed an enormous fortune, and it is hard to understand his son Anastasio Somoza's kleptocratic drive.
The Somoza family continued to loot the country, even though nearly 70% of Nicaraguans lived in poverty, and more than half the population was illiterate.
That was a turning point, because it wasn't just the population that saw it. Private businesses saw it too. With the money stolen by the dictatorship, they began setting up businesses that competed with the private sector. They started getting into insurance companies, banks, and other areas that had previously been entirely left to private enterprise. The complicity between private business and Somoza that had lasted a long time was broken by the 1972 earthquake. For me, that earthquake was the beginning of the end for Somoza.
Economic elites began to distance themselves from the regime. At the same time, the socialist Sandinista National Liberation Front was gaining strength. It was a movement founded in the early 1960s by young activists who took inspiration from Fidel Castro's guerrilla movement in Cuba. For years, the Sandinistas saw failure after failure, but in 1974, a Sandinista commando stormed the residence of a former Somoza government minister, taking hostages that included the foreign minister, the mayor of Managua, and a cousin of Somoza's. The Sandinistas used the hostages to get a ransom and to negotiate the release of several of their comrades from prison. From that moment on, the public started to see the Sandinistas as fighters against inequality and poverty. Their support among the people started growing.
A lot of the children of the elite, so to say, young students, actually became involved with the Sandinista movement. So what happened in Nicaragua was that the fathers, so to say, of the revolutionaries, they were the ones then who actually also started to break with the Somoza regime.
At the same time, within the Sandinista front, in the 1970s, a new strategy was adopted by the faction called the Tortaristas, the Third Front faction, which included Daniel Ortega. They advocated pragmatism and alliances with what they called the bourgeois forces in order to overthrow the dictatorship.
These new alliances upped the pressure on Anastasio Somoza, Anastasio II. There was also pressure coming from the press, especially from Pedro Joaquín Chamorro, owner and editor of the newspaper La Prensa, a longtime opponent of the regime who turned his newspaper into the country's main opposition voice. Now, at that time, no one could have imagined that Rosario Murillo would one day become co-president and supreme commander of the armed forces. She had started working at La Prensa in the late 60s as a temporary replacement for Chamorro's secretary. On January the 10th, 1978, Pedro Joaquín Chamorro was assassinated in a drive-by shooting. Nicaraguans were convinced the country's dictator, Anastasio Somoza, had ordered the hit. There was so much public outrage over the killing that it actually strengthened cooperation between conservative parties and the Sandinista front to bring down the dictatorship together.
The act has so galvanized the American public toward unity in the last decade.
In the United States, President Jimmy Carter had already paved the way by suspending military aid to Nicaragua.
We are dedicated to the principles and the honor of our nation.
When Carter came into the White House, he made human rights a central part of U.S. foreign policy. That, of course, was completely incompatible with him backing dictators abroad. Now, he didn't take direct action to overthrow Anastasio Somoza, but Carter also didn't do anything to stop the dictatorship from collapsing.
To gain the support of Nicaragua's middle and upper classes, the Sandinista front assured them that its goal was democracy, and that it had no intention of aligning with the Soviet Union.
When it became clear that the revolution was going to succeed, 3 key promises were made to dispel fears of communism: political pluralism, a mixed economy, and non-alignment. Along with these 3 promises, there were assurances made, just like Fidel Castro had done, that there would be no communism, no centralization of power like what was happening in Cuba.
With those promises, the entire country, left and right, business owners and small farmers, mobilized against the Somoza dynasty. Finally, on July the 17th, 1979, the dictatorship was overthrown. Nicaragua was no longer under the control of one family that had plundered the country for 43 years. Anastasio Somoza Debayle fled Nicaragua with part of his fortune. After a brief stay in the United States, he was granted asylum by another dictator, Alfredo Stroessner, in Paraguay. He was killed there soon after in an attack in 1980. In Nicaragua, the end of the Somoza family's long-standing dictatorship unleashed a huge wave of joy, and the Sandinistas, known in Spanish as the FSLN, gained more and more supporters.
We were all nice young people, I think, mostly from the bourgeoisie or from backgrounds of privilege. Those privileged young people would go to work with liberation theology priests in the neighborhoods, where they became politically aware and also carried out significant grassroots work. Sandinismo was truly a grassroots organization. People came together to support it, because you would go into a neighborhood, see what was the main problem in that neighborhood, whether there was no water or bad roads, and then organize the community to fight for those rights and improvements.
We know
about the Cuban Revolution. It had a very complicated relationship with religion. But the Sandinistas, they presented themselves as kind of a Christian movement as well. And there were many Christians involved in the Sandinista movement. And famously, Ernesto Cardenal was a liberation theologian, and he became one of the ministers of the in the Sandinista government. So there were priests part of the FSLN, and many progressive Christians also joined the FSLN. And I think that is because of liberation theology, which is obviously a Christian movement that integrated kind of Marxism and ideas about social justice into its theology, and that blended perfectly with Sandinismo, which was obviously also about social justice and improving the standard of living, liberating the oppressed, and so that worked really well together.
The role of the church is meant to be caring for the disadvantaged. That's what's called the preferential option for the poor. At the same time, the church also became a vehicle for spreading Sandinismo within the population and communities. As a result, churches and temples turned into spaces for political dialogue, places where people could speak out against injustices.
At first, things improved for a lot of Nicaraguans.
They immediately embarked on this kind of radical program of social transformation. So one of the most famous programs was their literacy campaign, which meant that young Nicaraguans from the cities, from the urban areas, traveled to the countryside in order to teach people literacy skills. And this was a huge success. It drastically reduced literacy. There are also improvements in healthcare, vaccination campaigns. So there was a massive attempt to improve the standard of living and to kind of bridge the gap between kind of the urban and the rural areas.
The literacy campaign started in 1980. In just 5 months, illiteracy in Nicaragua dropped from 50% down to 13%. The national budget for education was multiplied by 10 compared to the Somoza era. Enrollment in primary schools rose from 65% of children in 1978 to 80% just 2 years later. And people were truly excited about Nicaragua's gains in education. In Europe, it was a big topic among social democratic parties, and around the world among various leftist and center-left parties.
The Sandinistas were seen by many social democrats as a potential kind of third way, a revolution that would be social democratic in nature and that wouldn't turn communists like the Cuban Revolution. And the Sandinistas really encouraged that idea, that they were kind of moving beyond, transcending the Cold War binaries and have a third way that kind of ensured that the people participated in a revolution that would be democratic but also be about social justice. But the European support for the revolution was also as a result of a successful Sandinistas foreign policy campaign, in which they presented the revolution in a positive light by sharing music, by traveling and having posters, by inviting people to Nicaragua to participate in the revolution. So they successfully presented the revolution in a really romanticized and popular way as a progressive feminist revolution.
Right after Anastasio Somoza fled Nicaragua, a caretaker government was created, the Government Junta of National Reconstruction. It was a broad, temporary body meant to run Nicaragua until elections could be held. The junta reflected a spirit of cooperation that existed immediately after the Somoza dictatorship. It included 2 opposition figures, most notably Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, the widow of the assassinated journalist Pedro Joaquin Chamorro. There were also 3 Sandinistas, including Daniel Ortega, who at the time was far from being the most prominent of the Sandinista commanders.
I think it was his brother Humberto who was a leader in the army and also a strategist who put him there, because Daniel Ortega had neither popular support nor did many people know him.
That further strengthened the position of Daniel Ortega and of his brother Humberto Ortega, who was the driving force that allowed Ortega to take power, since Humberto would become head of the army.
At the same time the Sandinistas were consolidating power in Nicaragua, former members of Somoza's National Guard were forming an armed group to try to push them out. And a change of leadership in the White House in 1981 gave momentum to the anti-Sandinista forces. The new US President, Ronald Reagan, distrusted the Sandinistas and their promises not to align with Moscow.
If we don't act now, the dangers will grow. New Cubas will arise. The cost of it.
He famously said he would roll back communism in Central America. So for Reagan, what was happening in Nicaragua, but also wider in Central America, was just evidence of the growing rise of Soviet power, of Cuban power in what he saw as kind of the United States sphere of influence. But Reagan basically wanted to get the Sandinistas out of power, ideally through military means. So Reagan's rise to power really ensured that there was more civil war, that the civil war continued.
Reagan's support for the Nicaraguan Contra rebels went so far that in 1984, when the U.S. Congress decided to limit aid to the Contras, the Reagan administration found clandestine ways to continue funding the Anti-Sandinista insurgency. The clearest example is the Iran-Contra scandal, or Irangate, in which the Reagan administration secretly sold weapons to Iran, an enemy of the U.S., and used the profits to finance the Contras.
Para, con los beneficios, poder financiar a los Contras.
On top of that, in recent years there have been well-founded accusations of possible indirect CIA involvement in drug trafficking in order to finance the Nicaraguan Contras.
The counter-revolution began arming itself just as the literacy campaign was coming to an end. Nicaragua really had only about a year and a half of the revolution's initial transformative phase, because as the literacy campaign was still wrapping up, a young literacy teacher was killed. That killing was part of the counter-revolution being organized by former Somoza soldiers who had regrouped in Honduras alongside a massive propaganda campaign telling peasants that their children would be taken away and that vaccines would inject them with communism.
Que les iban a quitar a los hijos, que las vacunas le iban a inyectar comunismo.
Propaganda led many of the rural poor to turn against the Sandinistas. Another factor was the Sandinistas' growing authoritarianism. In regions that had long enjoyed a degree of autonomy, the government tried to impose Spanish-language literacy programs, agrarian reform, and the nationalization of resources, measures that were all deeply disruptive for the indigenous Miskito people on the Atlantic coast. Under the Sandinistas, they suffered summary executions, torture, and forced disappearances.
We need to think about how they considered themselves to be very different from the mestizo Spanish-speaking population that lived in the other side of the country. They never really felt part of the revolution. The war against Somoza didn't take place necessarily on the Atlantic coast. And they also considered, when the Sandinistas came, they to kind of improve the standard of living, for instance, but also with the literacy campaign, which was originally meant to be in Spanish, they saw that as kind of a threat to their autonomy.
The most extreme example of this kind of policy came when the Sandinista government ordered the forced relocation of the indigenous Miskito communities living near the Honduran border. It traumatized the Miskito because it meant abandoning their ancestral lands and losing their property. All of this created deep resentment that turned into a genuine armed uprising organized by the Miskito, who became part of the Contra movement and spent the next years in armed conflict against the Sandinista government.
While facing an armed conflict on multiple fronts across the country, the Sandinistas were changing the structures of power to their favor. Little by little, they erased the separations between the party and the government, the army, and the different branches of the state. And even though they'd promised to hold elections as soon as possible back when they were still fighting against the Somoza Dictatorship, as they became more powerful, that promise was forgotten. In August 1980, Humberto Ortega said something that sounded a lot like Fidel Castro. The demand for elections is part of the counter-revolutionary threat. But later, the Sandinista leaders changed their minds. They didn't want to upset the wealthy European countries who were giving Nicaragua crucial political and financial support, and who were demanding elections. So in 1984, 5 years after the fall of the Somozas, the first elections were held. Daniel Ortega, by that point, dominated the Sandinista party. As their presidential candidate, he won with 63% of the vote. But it wasn't just because of the government's social programs.
Important figures from what would become the civil opposition on the right, such as Violeta Chamorro and Alfonso Robelo, decided not to run in the elections because they believed the process was a farce. And it's true that the opposition candidates who did choose to participate found themselves subjected to restrictions imposed by the Sandinista government, meant to prevent them from campaigning successfully. For example, the government lifted the state of emergency only a few weeks before the elections, which made it extremely difficult for the parties to hold rallies and meetings, while the Sandinista government itself had all the resources of the state at its disposal to run its campaign.
The main opposition candidate withdrew from the elections, and later it came to light that that was also because the United States put pressure on him to withdraw. So there was a lot of CIA pressure and a CIA campaign to make these elections seem illegitimate as well. So in a way, these elections were kind of a campaign for the international public opinion rather than for domestic public opinion.
Even though Ortega won the election, the years that followed were tough for the Sandinistas. Nicaragua was fragmented by different groups fighting against the Sandinistas. The conservative Nicaraguan Democratic Force and the left-leaning Democratic Revolutionary Alliance, also known as the ARDE, controlled large areas of the north and center of the country. On the Atlantic coast, the Mosquito insurgency was very active. In the south, the Sandinista Revolutionary Front, a dissident guerrilla group that split off from the Sandinista National Liberation Front under leader Eden Pastora, who years later would become a loyal Ortega supporter. By 1988, various Contra groups, meaning groups opposed to the Sandinistas, had loosely banded together to form the Nicaraguan Resistance Army. It operated mainly in the center of the country. The government in Managua didn't have the military strength to defeat it. As the fighting spread, the Sandinistas needed more and more soldiers.
They were drafting young people from the age of 17. They were practically hunting them down. They went into the neighborhoods, rounded them up, gave them a short training, and then sent them to war. Enormous numbers of people died on both sides. Around 50,000 deaths are estimated. That seems high to me, but it was at least 30,000. It was heartbreaking. Mothers turned against the revolution because they didn't want their sons taken away. It was a disaster. That military service and everything surrounding it really undermined support for the revolution.
It wasn't just the loss of life. The Sandinistas, who still saw their movement as an ongoing revolution in Nicaragua, were becoming increasingly authoritarian.
War is completely disruptive for a revolution. And it also gave those with authoritarian mindsets the perfect excuse to start tightening the screws and advance certain nationalizations, as they put it. They said when the revolution triumphed, the wealth taken from Somoza would be used to create a sector of property belonging to the people. Because Somoza and his accomplices controlled about 60% of Nicaragua's wealth. But what happened? Once the war began, the Sandinista leadership hardened its position, accusing the bourgeoisie of being responsible for letting the United States, the CIA, and all of that into Nicaragua.
A la burguesía de ser la que está haciendo que entre a Nicaragua y se meta a Nicaragua.
So they started confiscating businesses, farms, and so on, from people who should never have been targeted. People who weren't Somocistas, weren't accomplices of Somoza. They weren't Sandinistas, but some had even helped the Sandinista movement.
Pero habían hasta ayudado al sandinismo.
War, nationalizations, and the U.S. embargo imposed by President Ronald Reagan all left Nicaragua in a desperate situation.
Eso yo lo viví en persona.
I experienced it myself. We didn't have spark plugs. We didn't have toilet paper, toothpaste, cigarettes. Things just started disappearing. Supermarket shelves were empty, and all we had were potatoes and beans from socialist countries and Russian sardines. It was really sad what was happening in Nicaragua.
O sea, era bien triste lo que pasaba en Nicaragua.
The government was forced to negotiate peace with the insurgents. Under international pressure and as part of peace agreements, the Sandinistas also agreed to hold free elections in 1990, this time with opposition candidates fully participating. The Sandinistas expected they were going to win again, like in 1984, but they were in for a big surprise, because this time the winner was not Ortega, but conservative Violeta Barrios de Chamorro, the widow of the country's most respected journalist who'd been assassinated back in 1978. As the candidate for the National Opposition Union, she hadn't run in 1984, but this time she did, and she won with 54% of the vote.
And that's when Daniel Ortega gave the best speech of his life, the day he had to acknowledge his electoral defeat. A couple of days later, he gave another speech where he said, "We're going to govern from below." And he raised his tone. That was one of the reasons many of us opposed Daniel Ortega, because he began a whole effort to undermine the new government, and violently too. I mean, returning to violence. And we were saying, people are fed up with violence. Let's try to mount a constructive opposition and get back to power in a different way. We didn't want socialism in the Soviet style. At least many of us didn't. And even within the Sandinista front leadership, there were differences of opinion. Daniel Ortega was, I think, the hardest-headed person, a very intransigent person, not very educated. I don't think he had read much.
At first, Ortega was sidelined. Violeta Barrios de Chamorro's new government reversed the Sandinista expropriations. It worked to reconcile the country and to overcome the devastation of civil war. Chamorro also ended censorship of the press and promoted democratic reforms. But she made some unpopular decisions too. Her government cut social programs and ended free basic education. That made it hard for poor families, the majority of Nicaraguans, to keep their kids in school. Under the conservatives, illiteracy started rising again, from 13% to 22% between 1990 and 2007. But the greatest damage to the Nicaraguan right came from the president who succeeded Chamorro.
Violeta Chamorro stayed in office for 5 years and fulfilled the mandate of the Nicaraguan constitution that allowed only a 5-year term. She left, and then a disastrous man named Arnoldo Alemán came to power and unleashed an orgy of corruption. All Nicaraguans knew about the corruption, and because there was a free press, the newspapers exposed everything that was happening, and people were truly outraged. For instance, members of his government were building enormous mansions on the beach.
Although the right wing still won the next presidential elections with Enrique Bolaños, the damage to their reputation remained. Daniel Ortega took advantage of divisions among the right to win back the presidency in 2006. Since taking office again in 2007, he's shown no intention of giving up power again. Ortega started bringing the different branches of government under his control. Through bribes or threats, he won over deputies in the National Assembly, effectively neutralizing the legislature. Then he went after the judiciary, replacing judges who challenged him. He did the same with the fourth branch of Nicaragua's government, the Supreme Electoral Council.
He didn't want to leave at the time he was supposed to. So he reinterpreted the constitution to claim that he had the right to be re-elected. And of course, he was in control of the Supreme Electoral Council. He had placed all his loyalists in important positions with majorities. And then they began to try out a series of measures that were harmful to the country and especially harmful to the people.
Another dictator, Venezuela's Hugo Chavez, supplied Nicaragua with very cheap oil, which Managua sold at market prices. That allowed Daniel Ortega to reintroduce social programs. But Venezuela's own economic crisis worsened, and gradually it cut off the oil supply. For Nicaragua's public finances, it was a disaster. In 2018, the regime didn't have the money to pay for Social Security, so it raised workers' social contributions and put a 5% tax on pensions.
So the elderly and the young people who said their grandparents couldn't afford it took to the streets to protest. A force linked to Rosario Murillo from the Sandinista youth began attacking the elderly, knocking them to the ground, and assaulting young people with sticks and stones. It was something unprecedented. An aggression and violence that people were filming on their cell phones. And the videos started spreading all over Nicaragua. Those videos went viral, and more young people returned to the streets to protest. That protest on the first day even led to them entering the university.
I
was in Managua at the time, in April. I was there because of research, historical research. I was struck by kind of the bravery of the student protesters that went to the streets, even knowing that it would be very risky. But they went anyway. So it was just very kind of inspiring and impressive to see these students. It was also very scary because no one really knew what was going on. And it was, as kind of a historian, it felt really powerful as well to kind of see and feel this revolutionary momentum happening again in Nicaragua at a time when I was studying the revolution's history, and it was interesting to see many people comparing Ortega to Somoza. And so there was kind of this, they imagined themselves to be those fighting against Somoza, but now protesting against Ortega.
But for the students and their supporters, that courage came at a price.
The regime sent not only the police, but also so-called supporters. Some see them as outright criminals paid by the regime to beat protesters using chains and iron bars. This unprecedented violence led to forced disappearances, extrajudicial executions, and the use of torture.
Ejecuciones extrajudiciales y conlleva el ejercicio de la tortura. Human Rights Watch ha denunciado que
Human Rights Watch reported numerous cases of sexual violence against detainees and acts of torture, such as the tearing out of fingernails and the use of electric shocks.
o la utilización de descargas eléctricas.
We had carried out a revolution to prevent that kind of thing. We had gone 16 years without anything like that happening, and suddenly we began to see violence. People getting killed. Students started dying. A 15-year-old boy who was bringing water to young people who had taken refuge in the cathedral to escape the police.
The 2018 crackdown in Nicaragua left between 350 and 500 people dead, with another 2,000 injured and around 2,000 people arrested. Today, more than 100,000 Nicaraguans live in exile. Those who remain face persecution for even the slightest sign of dissent. Not even former top Sandinistas are safe, including Humberto Ortega, Daniel Ortega's brother, who helped him rise to power in 1979. He was put under house arrest after calling the president a dictator in 2024. We don't know exactly how Daniel Ortega responded in private to his brother's criticism, but this is what he said on TV.
El jefe del ejército ya tenía entregada su alma al diablo.
Sergio Ramirez, who was vice president from 1985 to 1990 and a member of the National Reconstruction Junta, was also accused in 2021 of supposed incitement to hatred for criticizing the regime. In 2023, the regime revoked his Nicaraguan citizenship. They did the same to Gioconda Belli and hundreds of other dissidents.
Since 2018, there hasn't been any more attempts at rebellion against the dictatorship because they have perfected a system of surveillance in people's neighborhoods.
Sistema de espionaje barrial en los barrios, donde es casi imposible.
That makes it almost impossible to organize any kind of resistance. And anyone suspected of being involved in resistance is imprisoned. There is a system of control, and this is something I also blame Cuba for. It has been exported, unfortunately, a system of control that has allowed them to stay in power. A system of espionage within families and neighborhoods that has effectively prevented people from continuing doing what they wanted to do, which was to rebel against Daniel Ortega and Rosario Murillo, like they did in 2018.
Contra Daniel Ortega y Rosario Murillo, como sucedió en el 2018.
If we think about why the revolution was so popular and why today is so different than the 80s, the Sandinistas made such a conscious effort to mobilize international public opinion, to look for support abroad, to kind of do the exact opposite basically of what it's doing now. So in the 1980s, they invited people over to participate in the revolution. Sandinistas traveled across the globe to mobilize support, to tell people and explain to people what the revolution was trying to achieve. Today, Ortega is doing the exact opposite. He's isolating, he's closing down the country.
Ortega and Murillo have shut the country down, and they're exploiting it for their own profit. On lands they control, protected forests are being cut down to expand cattle ranches and mining. In October 2025, they handed over more than 62,000 hectares to a Chinese company called Thomas Metal, in addition to the nearly 200,000 hectares it already controlled in Nicaragua for mining. The Nicaraguan exile publication Confidencial Digital reports that in the last 2 years, the regime has given 8 Chinese companies permission to mine well over 500,000 hectares in the North Pacific and Caribbean regions, even though none of these companies has a proven track record in mining. They appear to be private businesses that don't take responsibility for social or environmental damage in places where they operate. Some of these mining areas are in places with very high biodiversity, like the Indio Maíz Biological Reserve, where the Ortega-Murillo regime has already allowed 4 mines. Meanwhile, the presidential couple has built a personal fortune estimated at more than $2.5 billion. With Daniel Ortega's health now in question, Rosario Murillo has worked to secure power for herself, even without him. And she's come a very long way to reach this point. Before the revolution, she was the assistant secretary to the journalist Pedro Joaquin Chamorro. By 2025, she was co-president and the top commander of Nicaragua's armed forces, a position she reached through marriage. Murillo has left a trail of enemies, and although they're quiet now, one day they may seek revenge. To use her words, if not in this world, then perhaps in the next life.